My talk is not ready, but I thought it might be helpful to me anyway to attempt to say some of it. But what I'm beginning the talk with is the material from Reflections on Reality about Wön-ch'uk and his influence in Tibet. Since my talk is on Wön-ch'uk, I have to make sure that it's on Wön-ch'uk and not. So to say something about who he is seems crucial. So I'll do that. Then, in the section on mind only, Tson-kha-pa presents what the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought says about what requires interpretation and what is definitive among the scriptures within the fourfold context of refining Wön-ch'uk's 7th century presentation, criticizing the eclecticism of the 13th and 14th century Tibetan scholar adept Trungpa Sherab, who died 4 years after Tsongkhapa's birth. 3, presenting Indian mind-only scholarship in such a way that the architecture of the system can be engaged. 4, distinguishing the mind-only school from the consequent school, and thus setting the stage for his later exposition of Chandrakirti's criticism of the mind-only school and the autonomous school. Tson-kha-pa refers to Wön-ch'uk or his text 12 times, 3 by name, which is twice as Wön-ch'uk and once as Denusumba Wön-ch'uk, which means Tripitaka Wön-ch'uk, meaning Wön-ch'uk who is master of the 3 divisions of the scripture. 5 as Chinese great commentary, once within the commentaries, and 3 implicitly. And it's hard to determine which ones are implicit and which ones aren't. I've chosen what I think are the most obvious. So you can say those 3 are questionable, and the other 9 are for sure. The number of references and the fact that he does so by name 5 times are particularly significant, since Tson-kha-pa only obliquely refers to one other text written in Chinese, a commentary on the sutra by Paramartha, that most likely he knew only through Wön-ch'uk's commentary. Also, Tson-kha-pa does not even mention the name of any Tibetan scholar, including the one whom he is principally refuting, Sherab Gyaltsen, 1292 to 1361, whose opinions he rebukes 8 times. Tson-kha-pa's open references to Wön-ch'uk most likely derive from deference to his wide-ranging scholarship and from a wish to correct the opinions of an influential, if temporally distant scholar. I draw the latter conclusion from the fact that among the 12 references, Tson-kha-pa disagrees with Wön-ch'uk 6 times, refines his opinion 3 times, and agrees with Wön-ch'uk 3 times, 2 of these being unattributed sources for organizational grids. And that's actually not quite true. The agreement may be limited to 1. He may be refining the other 2 grids. In other words, Wön-ch'uk will have a more extensive way of breaking it down into a greater number of parts, and Tson-kha-pa will condense them. Now, I'm assuming that Tson-kha-pa is following Wön-ch'uk, but refining it for his own purpose.
So an organizational grid, is that more than just a subject?
That's all it is.
Okay.
But, I mean, it's a subject that, it's a contents that just deals with a quote. You know, you have a quote from the sutra, and how many parts are you going to break it into? So what should I call it? I at least should explain it, not bring up obscure, not make it obscure when it's not obscure at all. It is highly likely that through Wön-ch'uk's text, Tsong-kha-pa became aware of the scholarship of Bodhi-ruchi, Dharmapala, Paramartha, and Xuanzang, all of whom Tsong-kha-pa mentions in his separate presentation of the mind basis of all and afflicted intellect, written in his 20s. Ernst Steinpilner speculates that the Tibetan technique of employing elaborate sectioning and subsectioning of texts may stem from similarly elaborate sectioning in Wön-ch'uk's commentary. And if this is the case, Wön-ch'uk also gave rise to a predominant style of scholarly organization in Tibet, employed to greater and lesser degrees by scholars in all of the major sects. Throughout the first 4 chapters of the Essence of Eloquence, Tsong-kha-pa, while relying on Wön-ch'uk's presentation, seeks to correct many points. Tibetan and Mongolian commentators subject his remarks, as well as other points, with respect to limited parts of the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought. Sometimes he draws attention to facets of the sutra that that otherwise could easily be missed. That's for sure, isn't it? I mean, you could just read over it and keep with your same old ideas about what mind only is. And at other times, endows the sutra with retroactive meanings created by analyzing it in the light of subsequent scholastic developments. Now, the first problem I have is that the first of these goes from page 11 to page 60. And I've just sort of boiled it down to what's necessary. Now I have to see if anything can be said. You see, I'm starting with, what have I said about Wön-ch'uk in these 3 books? And now the phase comes of, what can you say in a 1-hour talk? And of course, you want to say everything. You want to refer to all 12. And which ones can you refer to? And the first one is the one on own character, in which Tsong was heavily criticizing Wön-ch'uk, but then his own statement that own character doesn't mean the definition of an object, rather it means establishment by way of its own character, that won't work, that many people see it as not working. Because if Buddha was teaching in the first wheel, that's supposed to require interpretation, that all of the aggregates, mental and physical aggregates, are established by way of their own character, then since in the mind-only school they accept that all of the aggregates are established by way of their own character, then when Buddha taught at least that portion of the first wheel, there was nothing that required interpretation. So people come up, this then you see is a matter of dealing with Tsong-kha-pa. And it moves the topic off of Wön-ch'uk. It's only I who bring it back to Wön-ch'uk. But that's part of what I'm saying, that this debate doesn't sit still, that I'm drawn into it too. But I'm here. I don't want to start with one where I'm reviving Wön-ch'uk. I don't mind bringing it up later. So Kunut Chögyal Trungpa, and then his successor, Jaya Sheba, says that when Tsong-kha-pa says established by way of its own character, he means and then rigidly applies that to at least the bulk of the references to Rangitseniki-trūpa, and gets, it just involves his tradition in all sorts of conniptions. And the other people say, no, he said Rangitseniki-trūpa, so we'll leave it at Rangitseniki-trūpa. But then we'll say that along with this is communicated Ranzundobe Shenshia Rangitseniki-trūpa. So it's all right if part of what he says doesn't require interpretation. It's this other thing that's communicated all along with it. And then that's some contemporary scholars give this opinion. Benjamin Sūtra says that the first wheel not only says that the arrogants, well, let's just stick with the arrogants because they are established by way of their own character. Not just that, it's not just being taught that they're established by way of their own character, but that their subject and object are different entities. Well, there's a huge problem with that, because Sūtra Unraveling the Thought, at this point in the 7th chapter, isn't talking about that. In the 8th chapter it does. So, plus, Sūtra is faced with the gnawing difficulty, which he avoids completely, that those phenomena that are permanent and in the mind-only school are not established by way of their own character, then what do you do with them? Do you say that part of the teaching is right? So they get wound up in, tremendous convolutions.
So the problem is that they can't make a blanket statement about the first wheel?
Yeah, they can't make a blanket statement that would cover all of the references to Rangzen. Now, Sarah J. Zumba says that there's a difference between Rangitseniki Truba and Dembar Truba. So he says in the mind-only school, all phenomena are Rangitseniki Truba, but only impermanent ones are Dembar Truba. See, this is really getting off into Gelu, and what I'm thinking is I've just got to knock out this first one. It really helps me a lot here to be talking about it, because it's very clear. It just strays off of Wön-ch'uk. It's only me who brings it back. Tson-kha-pa's point is that in the question, Paramartha Samugata says, for each and every one of these groups of phenomena, like form, the Buddha teaches own character. And he says this is the definition of an object, that which is obstructive. Now Tson-kha-pa says that has to be wrong, because in the answer, when Buddha says there's 3 types of ngonyameva, he says that Gunda, Tsenyi ngonyameva. And then right after it he says, Rangitsenyi neva mayimbe, which means Rangitsenyi truba mayimbe. So that makes it clear then, and he says Dokwe Daksan before that. So Rangitsenyi neva means Rangitsenyi truba. And so therefore in Tsenyi ngonyameva, the sutra is very clear itself that Tsenyi means Rangitsenyi truba. That Gunda lack being Rangitsenyi truba. Very clear. And I think he's right. And he says because that's what the word Tsenyi means in Gunda Tsenyi ngonyameva. Then in the question, when Paramartha Samudgata says that Rangzen, which means Rangitsenyi, but does that mean Rangitsenyi Truba, you see? That Rangzen should be the same as the Tsenyi ngonyameva Shebe Tsenyi. And that Tsenyi is Rangitsenyi Truba. Therefore, based on the answer, he determines that in the question, right, Rangzen should mean that. But isn't he over anxious? Perhaps, is what I say. It's true enough about the answer, but you see, once you have no tangetially, entity and attributes, and everybody agrees that Rangzen refers to the entity, and all of the others are attributes, production, blah, blah, blah. that Paramatta Samugata lays out for each of the 7 pronouncements, so-called, the 7 groups of phenomena that range from form, the first of the 5 aggregates, to the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, the last group. That the first one mentioned is Rangzen, so that should be Ngo. And the rest, and everybody agrees. In fact, one of my teachers in Lhasa, one of mine, I guess I've got only 2. Gen Denzin, the last of the Mongolian scholars, one day he said that Rangzen means the tsenyi, the tsenyi of the object. And I said, that's really good. That's very interesting, something like that. Except that it disagrees with Tsongkhap's opinion. And he sort of went, and that was the end of that conversation. And it's what you would naturally expect, Rangzen, Rangitsenyi, that, form is obstructive, that consciousness is that which knows, and so forth. And that's just what Wön-ch'uk cites. So I would be willing to say that the Rangzen of the question and the tsenyi of the answer are different. Although then you have to look into what it means to be Rangitsenyi Kitruba. Does it just mean to be established by way of having its own definition, and that definition not being definition means defining characteristics. So it's not some words. Or is it something that's merely imputed by conceptuality? According to Tsongkhapa, that isn't the meaning of Rangitsenyi Kitruba. But then it's never clear what is. And so in that 60 pages or so, is people's attempts to find out what it means. And my answer, as you found, was Ngusungi Nanyudu Gyoba, or something like that. Nobody says that. This is new. And, they'll immediately say something about Buddha, right? I say, no, this is Semjenki Wanducheva. This is in terms of Semjen, beings less than Buddhists. Buddha has mind, but it's not a Semjen, because a Buddha doesn't have a mind that has obstructions yet to be gotten rid of. So, just because you have a mind doesn't make you into a Semjen. You see, etymology is that which has a mind, but like lake-born, soge for lotus, not all lotuses are lake-born. Favorite example, upja, waterborne. That's an etymology. And ones that grow on dry land are also called upja in Sanskrit, and soge in Tibetan. Up is just water, but it's more, you get a closer term in Tibetan, I think, once it says lake. So then the problem with so I'm going back to Wön-ch'uk and I'm saying, look, this may be right, that part of it. But then what is the object, what is the factor that's being taught that's wrong? You see, Kunru Chujung, Kunru Chuki Jungne, and Jamyang Sheva say that you see this Rangzen is Rangzen Dobishinsha Rangitsenyi Kitruba. And by extension, that goes to all of the attributes that Paramartha says Buddha taught in the first wheel, like production. That means Ranjado Vishinshi Rangatani Trube Gyewa. And but that's rather interesting in itself. Why don't you just say no at the beginning and say it's within the context of Ranjado Vishinshi Rangatani Trube? You see, once Gyewa is in the context of Ranjado Vishinshi Rangatani Trube, right? Then why not say that about Rangzen, the Rangitsenyi? That's what I say. So that's what's, because the words aren't in those sutras anyway. The first wheel sutras don't say Ranjado Vishinshi Rangatsenyi Truba. First wheel sutras don't even say Rangatsenyi Truba. Don't say either of them. It just says Gyewa Yer, Dakwa Yer. You know? Now, if you look at the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra, it says Buddha taught all these many and various things. First wheel. That's all it says. That's all it says. In the second wheel, what did he say? First wheel, he taught that. What he didn't teach was that all phenomena are of the same taste. So somehow, the first wheel was taught within the context of an exaggeration. I don't think I'm adding anything to the sutra. You have to see, is all this talk about Rangitsenyi Truba and Rangzen, what do you say, Tsenying, does it really apply in, what's the importance of it? Is it just to be reading Chandrakirti's meaning in? See, Chandrakirti doesn't want anything to be Rangitsenyi Truba. And that's where Tsongkha was coming from. He's latching on to this. And I think he's right in the answer. But I don't know about the question. I think it may be the Rangitsenyi itself. So then, what can you say? The sutra itself doesn't say, except for that word Rangsen, that Buddha taught that all these things were Rangsen. In fact, couldn't have been. If you accept that Shenwang are Rangitsenyi Truba, but Gunda are not Rangitsenyi Truba. Because within the Gunda, there are some, the Yugyu Gunda, are not Rangitsenyi Truba. So then those aspects of the first turning of the wheel of Dharma would be literal. So, from looking at the fact that the sutra lays out, just all these things that the Buddha taught during the first wheel, if you look at the first chapter of the sutra, it doesn't speak about Rangsen or anything. Just, and the monks, I think it doesn't say nuns, the monks were debating about all these different things and had a lot of disagreements, and there's this and that and so forth. Now, if you look in the 9th and 10th chapters, there's this and that and so forth in the mind-only system. All right? So then what's the difference between this, that, and so forth in the mind-only system, many and various phenomena, and many, many and various phenomena in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma? It's that in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, Buddha did not teach that all of these are of one taste. One taste in emptiness. So then that means, I think it's really justified for Tsongkha to read into this, or to see in this, that the first wheel was taught within the context of an exaggeration. Has to be. There's no way not. And then that exaggeration has something to do with nyid and khyad of gundak be gunda, right? Imputational natures, which are imputations in the manner of entity and attribute. Now, what is nyid and khyad of gundak be gunda? It's nyid and, it sounds as if you're just imputing nyid and khyad, right? But in the latter chapters of the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought, or, you get vast layouts of the path of calm abiding, special insight, the 10 Bodhisattva grounds. There's no problem with nyid and kyid. But it must be within the context of one taste. Shwetamche rochi. Now when you think about it, just even the statement of nyid and kyid do gundakpa. The two gundaks at the end are just repetitive. From a point of English. When we think about things, like my new car, we have the new car, and it's got a very smooth ride compared to my last one. It's got, these are the kyid, very smooth ride, and I'm doing things like this. When I'm thinking about it, you have the know of the car, and it's got, more cargo space, station wagon, and the color is rather nifty, because you look at it in this light, it's black, you look at another light, it's dark blue, you look at another light, it's sparkly blue. Wow! These are features, right? This feature, that feature. In fact, when there's a group of us who first came here to Charlottesville, we used to play games with entity and attribute, and sort of set up the entity and then talk about qualities. Because most of the, it's hard to come up with the entity without the attributes. And, you can see a fundamental problem right away in entity and attributes. Believing too much in these. And what does believing too much in these mean? Probably something like or suk shijube jukbe jukshir rangitseniki truva. Kangba shijube jukbe jukshir rangitseniki truva. You see, there really is a meaning there to wording it this other way, not just entity and attribute. But wording it just as entity and attribute is very powerful too. You really get it clear if you start thinking, well, you can't have entity and attribute, In fact, Dharmakirti talks about how there's a non-dualism between entity and attribute, between object defined and the defining characteristic. And to be really bothered by entity and attribute, the force of saying we cannot speak or we shouldn't believe in entities and attributes can be greater than saying we shouldn't believe that mo the kera the gunda gunda rangatseniki truva. All right? Because you may be left thinking that no and kera do exist. You follow? Because you already think that they're rangatseniki truva, what you then think exists is something that really is rangatseniki truva, even if you say to yourself, it's just Tokwe Daksan. You see, in the Gelugpa way of doing it, you're always rescuing what does exist. These which are called entity and attribute, yore, do exist. Yinaya, now you see, unless you're really clever and put this meaning together, the initial impact of that, you actually can get out of the more complicated statement. But it's almost like the initial intuitive run on it, like when the sutra speaks of imputations in the manner of entity and attribute, the intuitive run on it is, when you penetrate it is, it's, my mind is messed up when I'm thinking, I have a car, and it's got this, and it's got this, it's got this. Oh, the brakes are really good, right? You just press on it and you stop. But in order to be able to present the path, and path has qualities, right? Entities and qualities. In what way does it exist? Now, the important thing is to realize that you don't understand how it exists, even though you say it exists. You know? But you don't understand that kind of existence. But you're using words as if you do. But the words are laying out the map to be understood. You know, people say, oh, don't fall to the extreme, thinking entities and attributes don't exist. Probably, if we understood that they don't exist, they aren't established by way of their own character as the reference of thoughts and terms, then we would think that would be quite equivalent to thinking they don't exist. Right? You know, the initial understanding of this, as in prasangika, would be like you'd feel you'd fall into extreme nihilism. And very hard to piece together after that how it does, these things actually do exist. Even the Dalai Lama in the spiritual autobiography that's going to come out probably in several years, speaks about his an initial, I don't know about initial, but a penetration of emptiness to the point where he couldn't solve the problem of how to posit things conventionally. You know, we always say things exist conventionally, they don't ultimately. But when you understand what it means to not exist ultimately, then it's, what is there to posit, you know? What does it mean? You can keep Tsongkhapa's teachings in mind, those focal teachings, and it's very interesting how he lists the focal teachings and so forth, that he's tried to penetrate, and he still leaves it as a problem. So the second reference. So I just had to be convinced that you can't bring up the first reference. You can put it in the list and then say, let's consider a few examples, and hope that during the question time nobody wants to consider this one. Although you can get into it then, because the points will have been, you know, about how. Anyway, second reference is included in the commentaries. And Tsongkapa is disagreeing about the meaning of a set of terms, and then Tsongkapa's commentators refine Tsongkapa's opinion. He next criticizes unidentified commentaries for mistaking the meaning of the various and manifold constituents mentioned in Paramartha Samudgata's question. He says that these should be taken as referring to the 18 constituents and the 6 constituents. This is because the sutra itself, when later in the 7th chapter, Paramartha Samudgata speaks about the 3 natures in terms of the aggregates, sense spheres, dependent arising constituents, and foods, in the same order as his question, and then mentions the 6 and 18. See, I don't think the second one is rich enough, but I would have to condense it, because you can't even that sentence. Those 2 sentences are still, so that's what Tsongkapa says. The order, the order of 6 and 8 has to be reversed to accommodate Tsongkapa's statement that these refer to the 18 and the 6. He says they refer to the 6 and 18. 18 and 6, sorry. And the sutra mentions the 6 and the 18. Wön-ch'uk takes both of these as referring to both various constituents and manifold constituents as referring to the 18, not the 6 and the 18. The various constituents he takes as being from their viewpoint of having internal differences, and the various, and thus being various. The second is from the viewpoint of the second manifold, from the viewpoint of their pervading all sentient beings. Guntang avers that Wön-ch'uk's explanation may be based on a Sangha's compendium of ascertainments. See, he goes into Guntang finds the source for Wön-ch'uk's version. Okay? Not for Tsongkha-pa's version, for Wön-ch'uk's version. It's clear what Tsongkha-pa's source is. It's later in the same chapter, where the various and manifold are talked about as whatever they are, the 18 and the 6, or the 6 and the 18. Guntang finds Wön-ch'uk's source, which is in Asangha's compendium of ascertainments. And then Guntang further points out that Wön-ch'uk's explanation accords with Sutra, the Mirobalan Sutra, and in Maitreya's Ornament for the Great Vehicle. So in a sutra, in a treatise, Maitreya's Ornament for the Great Vehicle Sutras, and in there it talks about the constituents, and those two texts talk about the constituents and interests of sentient beings as being various. So Guntang rejects Wön-ch'uk's explanation, even though he's found the source for it as being inappropriate here in the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought. But then he reveals a possible weakness in Tsongkhapa's argument, that in another chapter of the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought, the questions of Subhuti, the two terms are used in the context of applying many attributes to one substratum. Akulotra gyatso then, in other words, in another chapter of the sutra, Wön-ch'uk's explanation is correct. The questions of Subhuti. Then Akulotra gyatso tries to save Tsongkhapa's point by making the distinction that although the usage of these terms in the 7th chapter should be taken as Tsongkha-pa says, you can say that the sutra treats them the way Wön-ch'uk says. You see, it's a far more complex situation than what Tsongkha-pa has presented. Third reference, the organizational source. Apparently following Wön-ch'uk's structuring of Buddha's description of the naturelessness in terms of character in the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought, Tsongkha-pa divides it into a rhetorical question, an answer, or a rhetorical questioning of the reason, and an answer to that question. End of that one. It's the same as Wön-ch'uk. So that's a true agree. Fourth reference, Chinese Great Commentary, source of the meaning of a term. In the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought, the ultimate naturelessness is described as subsisting in permanent time and everlasting time. And Tsongkha approvingly cites Wön-ch'uk's explanation that these mean former and later time. Why say permanent and say everlasting? Why have this set of terms? But there has to always be a reason why Buddha says something. It can be for emphasis, but permanent, everlasting. So then the clever commentator, Wön-ch'uk, says permanent means in the past, everlasting means in the future. And of course, I've skewed the translation so that at least everlasting, you could say, oh yeah, well that refers a bit more to the future. Dakpa, tersuk. Then, Jigme Tamshin Gyatso identifies where the gloss is in Wön-ch'uk, this being not in the 7th chapter, but in the Subhuti chapter. And then cites Wön-ch'uk's many explanations of what permanent time and everlasting time mean in other contexts. Uses it to clear up, this is the thing that to clear up the, what would be the unintended import that permanent time always refers to past, everlasting time always refers to future, by pointing out that there are many meanings of these according to context. That's the fourth. The fifth, Chinese Great Commentary. Sāṃ-kha-pa cites Wön-ch'uk as the source for the resolution of an apparent conflict, and then he refines it. Now, in identifying what was behind Buddha's teaching in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, that all phenomena are unproduced, unceasing, quiescent from the start, and naturally thoroughly pass beyond sorrow. The Sūtra Unraveling the Thought, at this point, in the 7th chapter, speaks of only non-natures in terms of character and the ultimate naturelessness. Publ just speaks only, I bring up these terms, right, of imputational natures and the thoroughly established nature, not all three. Whereas a Sangha, in his compilation of manifest knowledge, says that these teachings are in relation to all three. How do you resolve that contradiction, apparent contradiction? And it's to point out that they had different purposes in mind. The Sūtra Unraveling the Thought is indicating that since other powered natures have production and cessation, the statements in the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought concerning no production and no cessation are not in consideration of other powered natures, etc. A Sangha, on the other hand, sought to demonstrate a correspondence between how each of the three natures is natureless and how they're also not produced. Tson-kha-pa implicitly criticizes Wön-ch'uk for referring to the mere existence of dependent arisings and not their existence by way of their own character. You see, existence by way of its own character didn't mean beings. It seems, at least that's the thesis I'm working on for Wön-ch'uk. So Tson-kha-pa, when he rephrases, he says, I even put our own version. He gives Wön-ch'uk's version, and then it shifts in tone. He doesn't say Wön-ch'uk's wrong or anything, but he brings up that not just that dependent arisings exist, but that they exist by way of their own character. Tson-kha-pa's procedure is typical. First, he gives Wön-ch'uk credit for the general point, but then he re-explains the issue to improve the presentation, right? Yeah. Sixth reference, adapting an organizational grid. Adapting an outline of a sutra passage. How's that? Which can be explained, right, quite easily, as opposed to organizational grid, which seems to have more import than good. Unlike Tson-kha-pa's sixfold division of the sutra passage about the first wheel of doctrine, its place, its trainees, its entity, its subjects of expression, its praise, and its not being of definitive meaning, Wön-ch'uk divides a slightly longer passage into two parts with several subdivisions. So the two sections are indicating that the first wheel of doctrine itself is lofty. The second section is indicating that the first wheel of doctrine is inferior and not of definitive meaning. Indicating that the first wheel of doctrine is lofty has 5 parts, indicating the petitioner and the respondent. The Bodhisattva Paramartha Samudgata is speaking to the supermundane victor. Then this is the second within the first, right? Indicating it's lofty. Indicating the time that when it was spoken, initially. Indicating the place where it was spoken, in the area of Varanasi in the Deer Park called Sages Propounding. Indicating those for whom it was spoken, for those engaged in the hero vehicle. Indicating the wheel of doctrine, thoroughly turned a wheel of doctrine through teaching the aspects of the Four Truths. So that's indicating that the first wheel of doctrine itself is lofty. Then the second part he takes as indicating the first wheel of doctrine is inferior and not of definitive meaning. Fantastic and marvelous, which none god or human had turned in a similar fashion in the world, but that wheel of doctrine thoroughly turned by the supramundane victor is surpassable, provides an opportunity understood for refutation, is of interpretable meaning, and serves as a basis for controversy. Sāṃdhinirmocana-sūtra not only does not use Wön-ch'uk's twofold division of the sutra passage, but also eliminates the category of indicating the petitioner, Paramartha Samudgata, and the respondent, Buddha, most likely because these are obvious, as well as that of time, that it was initial, and adds the category of praise. He also changes Wön-ch'uk's category of indicating the wheel of doctrine into two categories, entity and subjects of expression. He does this without mentioning Wön-ch'uk. But I'm claiming, since he was following Wön-ch'uk and criticizing him so much, that he's working from Wön-ch'uk's basic outline and refining it. Then, the seventh reference is to Wön-ch'uk. Sāṃdhinirmocana draws on and refines Wön-ch'uk's explanations of terms. Sāṃdhinirmocana gives two versions of the four qualities mentioned in the Sūtra Unraveling the Thought to describe the first turning of the wheel of doctrine. In the first list, he paraphrases Wön-ch'uk's explanation, but changes Wön-ch'uk's order. In the second list, he gives his own interpretation of the four. Wön-ch'uk himself says, because this wheel of doctrine holds back, that is to say, hides, emptiness, and teaches everything as just existent. You notice he doesn't say as Rangitsen-nikitruba or. It, one, is of interpretable meaning. So that's the first quality. It requires interpretation. Because it fully teaches the cause and effects of cyclic existence and nirvana, as well as the selfness of persons, and does not teach the reasoning of an emptiness of phenomena, this teaching of the first wheel of doctrine, and this is number 2, is a teaching that has a special understood doctrine higher than it. So that's 1 and 2, interpretable meaning, and there's something higher. Number 3 is a teaching in relation to which there is occasion for something more special. Looks like number 2, right? And is susceptible to destruction by others in debate, like proponents of mind only. Then number 4, first wheel is a source of controversy among the 20 sects of hearers. Now, and the interesting point is that when Sāṃdhinirmocana gives, an interesting point, is that when Sāṃdhinirmocana gives Wön-ch'uk's explanation, he changes the order. Well, let's put it this way. I should have said first. When Wön-ch'uk explains the sutra, he puts the third quality as the first quality, that it requires interpretation. When Sāṃdhinirmocana reports it, he shifts it back to the order of the sutra. He shifts, when he reports Wön-ch'uk's version, he shifts it back to the order of the sutra. As Guntang says, this is because Wön-ch'uk sees the sutra's first, second, and fourth qualities as being consequences of the first wheels as the first wheels requiring interpretation. So you see in his commentary, he shifts it. The import of Guntang's bringing this up is that Tsongkhapa's rendition of Wön-ch'uk's list of the four does not communicate Wön-ch'uk's intended meaning. It does. See, this is how they criticize. It's done. You don't just say, oh, well, and he missed that point. You just leave it. It's cool. But it drives you nuts until you figure out that's what they're doing. I had one teacher who used to wink at me at those points and say, Guntang's really on. One used to say, Giant Sheba and Guntang and so forth really corrected a lot of songs. With a slight backing off of the statement, but just slight. And then Guntang explains in what sense Wön-ch'uk and Tsongkha-pa agree. In his own listing of the 4 points, Tsongkha-pa objects only to Wön-ch'uk's rendering of the second. However, he rewords all 4. Guntang says, since Tsongkha-pa did not make a refutation of the other 3, they accord in meaning with his own system. Just in what sense do they agree? Not in the terminology, but in the meaning. So, most likely Guntang is suggesting that even if 3 of Tsongkhapa's list agree with Wön-ch'uk's in meaning, the phraseology is markedly different. And then I say, Hopkins says, being drawn into this, it seems to me that Tsongkha-pa also does not accept the meaning of Wön-ch'uk's rendition of the 3rd quality, unless by exists, Wön-ch'uk intends not mere existence, but existence by way of its own character. A point that Tsongkha-pa never wants to bring up. It's sort of as if, let's take that as if this is to be, taken for granted in Wön-ch'uk's work. But Tsongkha himself repeatedly says that the issue is not with existence, but with existence by way of its own character. Also, Tsongkha cannot accept the first part of the 4th quality. That's why everybody has to have a list of them. As Wön-ch'uk presents it. Since Tsongkha considers the first wheel's susceptibility to destruction by others through debate to be the meaning of the 2nd quality. He would not, however, have any substantial quarrel with Wön-ch'uk's description of the 1st quality. Wow. Whew. It's like off. Everybody's nodding off. You mean, did he come all the way from Virginia to say this? So anyway, this was the first of the 2 that I said were possibly evocative of the play, but I can't bring up as the first one that I've gotten involved with. I don't think so. That can't be the first one I talk about, because it leaves it too much with me, and that's not my point. Or either drop out the whole section, but it's, I have to say I have problems with this, with all of it. 8th reference is the other one I thought, and it's implicit. It's disagreeing about the meaning of a term. Tsongkha disagrees with Wön-ch'uk about the meaning of a term, and that disagreement is elaborately defended by Guntang. But really it seems that Guntang is just criticizing Tsongkha for disagreeing with Wön-ch'uk. In Guntang's difficult points, a hypothetical opponent points out that Wön-ch'uk himself makes destruction by others as part of his explanation of the sutra's 2nd quality. According to this hypothetical critic, Tsongkha has misplaced destruction by others as part of the sutra's 4th quality. due to the ambiguity of the Tibetan translation of Tsongkhapa's rearrangement of these four in his own list. The hypothetical critic objects that it should be put with the material preceding it. Okay. We have the first wheel for its, in other words, there's an ambiguity in the Tibetan with respect to the first wheel, but there's no ambiguity with regard to these same phrases with respect to the third wheel. And in the third wheel, these two go together. And in the first wheel, you could read it in such a way that they don't go together. But you should take the third wheel reading, which is taking these same qualities but saying meva, and superimpose that as yerba on the first wheel.
And what terms are you referring to?
Choktu gyurbe gup. This is not in the sutra, but in Wön-ch'uk's commentary. That, in other words, the meaning is that Tsongkha has misrendered Wön-ch'uk's commentary, which he has, I guess. But Guntan gives an elaborate defense of Tsongkhapa's apparent slip with regard to the first wheel, and he pretends that there's a reason for it. All right, well, thank you so much, really, for sitting through this, because it told me a lot, you know. It's going to help me a lot in the next phase of boiling it down. Do you think I can? Can you imagine?
You said 20 sects of hearers? Is that 18 Vaibhashika and 2 Saṃdhinirmocana?
Yeah, it's interesting. Devan Yishu. That's Wön-ch'uk.
I mean, is that what he's saying? I mean, what do you know?
Huh?
Is that 18 Vaibhashika and 2
Oh, Buna, I don't know what he's referring to. That would be convenient, but I wouldn't go so far as to say.